China has built and demolished billions of dollars worth of real estate in the last 20 years. To anyone who is paying attention, this can only be seen as a sign of a greater problem that might point to a weaker China than the one that we have been told exists. And to that end, allow me to explain more on today's topic, the blight of China's Tofu dreg construction projects. Now, for anyone who is completely unfamiliar with the topic that we are talking about today, I want you to join me on a little bit of a hypothetical thought experiment, an imagination journey, if you will. I would like you to imagine that you just got home after a long day of work. The hours that you've been working are brutal, and the pay just isn't really something that is great. You have struggled for years to save up to try and buy a property of your own from the government. And in your country, this is really the only way to actually own private property. And it's the way that most of your friends and family choose to invest their life savings. Well, after taking the train today, you finally get home and walk out of the elevator that is heading to your door of your 24th floor apartment, only to find that there is raw sewage spreading out from underneath the door of your apartment. It's coming from the floor above. You now have to clean your very expensive apartment, something that is fully flooded with dookie water and unknown floating objects, and you are angry. You are angry, you are exhausted, and you are hoping that anyone out there is going to help you and make things right. Except, as soon as you go and call the building supervisor, you then get told that it's not their fault. Okay. You get the runaround from the local city government, who is not going to do anything, and the local police are not wanting to get involved as well. A full week later, the city goes and sends inspectors to your building in order to check on conditions, and they basically do nothing. They do nothing to help the problem. They make everyone go and instead run out for a fire drill as a kind of show for local state-owned media cameras, and then they leave. Nothing happens. And after they leave, nothing is done to improve the building's terrible plumbing and drainage. The damage to your place that occurs during this time is utterly devastating, and you are now stuck in a mortgage for this place that the government will not let you out of. This is just one of many stories that have become increasingly more and more common to hear coming out of the People's Republic of China. And it is not good. Another recent inspection in a Chinese high-rise had inspectors finding out that the fire hoses in about half of the floors of one residential high-rise were actually just connected to pipes that didn't have any water running through them. This is something that has actually cost lives during real fires as well. Thankfully, at least in this circumstance for the residents of this building, the inspectors were actually committed to doing their jobs, and the issue was publicized on social media as well. The question is, in this day and age, why is something like this becoming significantly more and more common? If you go onto Google or YouTube or really any kind of search platform at all, and you type in the words Chinese infrastructure, then generally speaking, you're going to be presented with massive images of mega projects, of truly insane scales of buildings and other types of constructions that have been created in record time. And for decades, people have been wondering how has China been capable of building all of this so quickly? Certain political pundits and commentators and journalists will take the entire thing as a sign of Chinese superiority, that they are simply capable of doing this because of how powerful the government, because of how great its industry is. But less than 2 decades after the start of all of these massive infrastructure projects, stories of disasters are becoming more and more common. Question is, how did we get here? Now, before we get back to the episode, I would like to thank our sponsor, Aura. My friends, I am well aware that a lot of you are using the internet in order to watch this video right now, and have you, by any chance, ever Googled yourself and been shocked to actually find your own personal information that is exposed on one of those public listing sites or anything like that? With both myself and my wife being creators of content on the internet at times can be a very nasty place, and there are a lot of people who have gone against us, to say the least. So having our information out there makes us pretty uncomfortable. Data brokers are making a fortune selling your information to robocallers, to spammers, and to anyone else who wants to learn more information about you, like where you live. Aura can identify data brokers that are exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. Brokers are legally required to remove your info if you ask them to, but they always make it extremely hard to do so in the first place. That is where Aura can come in and handle everything for you, and it is incredibly nice to have. It's incredibly easy to set up. You don't have to download several different apps in order to get things like parent controls, antivirus, VPNs, password management, or literally anything else. You can just get everything at one affordable price altogether. So look, if you want to be taken advantage of on the internet, then that is your choice. But if you want to be able to protect your family, then by all means, go and click the link down in my description and get Aura today. Well, my friends, in order to be able to understand any of this, we have to go and look at the past and understand the context that leads us to today. Over the course of the last 60 years, all the way up until 2022, China's population would grow steadily every every single year. And due to this and the Chinese economic boom that would occur during the 1980s and 90s, many would predict for decades that China would grow to be the world's next superpower. This is a country that went from being mostly populated in rural areas to having massive megacities with utterly insane population density in less than 20 years. And many economists could tell with some certainty by the 1990s that China would eventually become the world's largest economy. It, technically speaking, accomplished this when it became the world's largest exporter of goods in 2009, and in 2013, China became the largest trading nation of goods in the world based on the value of its imports and exports. The United States previously held that position, and it will likely change again, but it's truly impressive when you go and look at the numbers that we're talking about here. Data from the World Bank would indicate that the country's total exports amounted to $3.7 trillion in 2022. And I know that a number of you are probably thinking right now, okay, well, Haystack, if the economy is so impressive, if all this is so great, then why are issues with buildings becoming so common and prevalent? Well, that, my friends, is exactly what we're going to be jumping into here now. So to sum it up, in the Chinese-speaking world, a commonly used phrase to describe buildings that are built with low quality, with dangerous materials that literally begin to fall apart, is tofu dregs. This was a phrase that was coined by Zhu Rongyi, the former premier of the People's Republic of China, back on a 1998 visit to Jiujiang City in Jiangxi province in order to describe a poorly built set of flood dikes in the Yangtze River. In China, the term tofu dregs refers to the pieces that are left over after making tofu, and so it's widely used as a metaphor for shoddy work. Hence, the implication that a tofu dreg project is a poorly executed project. And so, okay, you have a poorly built building. That is something that can happen pretty much anywhere in the world, and it does happen all throughout time and history. That is certainly true. The question is, why do all of these tofu dreg projects become built so commonly in China? Like, why is that becoming more and more of a thing? Well, there's two main reasons for that: corruption and the Chinese Communist Party, which are two things that most certainly go hand in hand. It truly is a story that is as old as time. Yet another communist country containing millions, or in this case even billions, of citizens who suffer daily due to the incompetence and corruption of individuals who work for the government or are part of the National Communist Party. This happened in Soviet Russia, this happened in Cuba, and it's happened in many other countries as well. But now it's China's turn to be center stage for the issue, and oh boy, are they going big. But that all being said, there is a major difference. Over the course of the 1970s and the 1980s, China was rapidly modernizing, but the Chinese Communist Party knew that in order to be able to feed, in order to house, in order to employ its rapidly expanding population, it needed to be able to have sufficient infrastructure. And meeting the need for this demand would generate an economic boom that was truly of a historic scale. And essentially, this is how it would work. The 1982 Constitution would provide for the, quote, socialist public ownership of the means of production, which is something that would take two forms: state ownership and collective ownership. In 2004, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution was made, and Article 13 of the Constitution would provide that, quote, the lawful private property of citizens shall be inviolable. The most recent development would then be the enactment of the property law in March of 2007, this being after 14 years of debates, which is noted as one of the most important core components of the evolving civil law in the People's Republic of China, which, for the first time, protects the interest of private investors to the same extent as that of national interests. According to the Constitution, land in cities is something that is owned by the state. Land in the rural and suburban areas is owned by the state or by collectives. Although individuals cannot technically privately own land, they may obtain transferable land use rights for a number of years for a fee. There are a series of different laws and regulations that regulate the land use rights and ownership of residential property, but they mostly break down like this. A land user only obtains the land use right, not the land or any resources that are in or below the land. A land grant contract can then be entered into between the land user and the land administrative department of the people's government at the municipal or county level. For any land use rights that are intended to be used for residential purposes, the longest term that you can lease the land for is 70 years. So it was then that because of strict laws regarding private ownership of property, many people in China began to invest their life savings into real estate over the course of the 1980s and 90s. There really wasn't anything else that they could invest in. And so because it was the largest investment that most people could make and demand was sky high, the construction market in China would straight up explode leading up to the year 2000. And as all of this is going down, there would be a Chinese businessman in the southern city of Guangzhou who would start a company in 1996 that would make history, but that story is going to come here a little bit later. China would thus experience unprecedented growth at the turn of the century. Projects began being erected at an astonishing pace, and it got to the point that the speed of Chinese construction was something that became world famous. Oh, I'm sorry, did I say famous? I meant, infamous. And here's what it is that I mean. At one point, cutting corners and dodging safety regulations became such an art in China that they threw together a skyscraper in just 57 days. For a frame of reference, so you understand what it is that I'm talking about, most skyscrapers take at least a year or more to build. And even when we talk about it still taking a year, that is with an unusually fast time frame. For them to build a whole skyscraper in 57 days, well, let me just go ahead and say that you probably won't find me walking into the lobby of that building anytime soon, not the least of which is more than likely because I will not be allowed in China from everything that I have been talking about. But either way, back to the economy part of this whole thing. Things began to change around 10 to 15 years ago, by which time China had largely closed the gap between the investment that it had and the investment that the economy could productively absorb. But the need to rebalance the economy away from investment, from billionaires and institutions, and towards consumption with household incomes, well, that was something that was not very popular in the halls of power of government, and so they didn't really do anything about it. Beijing would instead double down on driving investment, and in this case, by any means necessary. And what the government found, just like what people found for their own investments, was that real estate, that seemed to be where it was at. Like nearly every other country that has followed this model, China began to over-invest systemically into projects that would contribute less and less and less to the economy than they actually cost. So everyone began building and building and building and even more building, even after economists warned that it was a bad idea. Cities began to pop up that could house hundreds of thousands of people. The government would even sometimes select a rural area and just drop a city in it. But then they would then neglect to bother to build additional infrastructure in the area, so you would end up seeing this beautiful modern residential high-rise complex just out in the middle of nowhere. There is no business. There were no amenities. There was nothing that would actually draw people in. And adding to the problems, many Chinese citizens were so desperate to just get a home that many would purchase a unit without ever having actually seen the unit in the first place. This is something that anywhere in the world would essentially guarantee that corruption would find a foothold. And oh boy, would it. You see, my friends, construction projects require huge budgets as well as bank loans. And by cutting corners here and there, developers and contractors are able to pocket large sums of money. This means that skimping on things like wall insulation, substituting quality exterior and interior cladding materials for inferior ones, and even using cheaper plumbing and electrical equipment are all viable options to try and pocket more of the money. These shoddy business practices became so prevalent that even in a free speech black hole like China, social media began to include videos of buildings literally falling apart after just a few years of being built. We're talking about concrete that ends up being so weak that the average person could just walk up to it and crumble the entire thing like crusty bread. Or it could even be the rebar that is inside that concrete that ends up being so weak it provides no real support because someone is capable of just snapping it in half with their hands like cheap plastic. As an example of the systemic problem that I'm talking about here, in 2011, factories in the province of Zhengzhou were under fire for pulling steel reinforcement rods to illegal diameters. Rods that were supposed to be 10 millimeters wide were instead stretched to a thickness of 8.5 millimeters, creating additional meters of steel, which were then sold on for extra cash. Then after this, there was the collapse of a 13-story block of apartments at the Lotus Riverside, a complex of 11 residential buildings in Shanghai, which saw the building literally topple over and kill one worker. It was then later reported that the company's construction license had actually expired back in 2004. The amount of videos that have popped up on social media for anyone that does even a cursory amount of searching showing construction workers, inspectors, or even just average residents themselves easily bending or twisting supposed steel rebar like it's some kind of carnival trick is, again, quite frankly concerning. And other times, as I said, it was the concrete itself, like the primary ingredient for making a building in the first place, that would end up being the major problem. I mean, concrete itself is one of the most common building materials to be used in the entire world. It is the thing upon which modern construction is essentially based around. And the recipe to make it is overall relatively simple. You need cement, you need some kind of aggregate, and water. and that's basically it. But the strength of that final batch is going to then largely depend upon the type of aggregate and cement that you put in, along with how much water and essentially the ratios that go between all of it. Commonly, the aggregate that is used in many modern building projects consists of crushed gravel or other rock, including sand. And that is the cause of so much distress in the Chinese construction industry. Inspections by state officials in 2013 found raw, unprocessed sea sand in at least 15 buildings under construction in Shenzhen, including a building which, when finished, was set to become one of China's tallest. The Ping An Finance Center, which is the thing that you can see behind me right here, like easily one of the most obvious things in this picture, is a truly massive thing, topping out at 660 meters, making it not only China's second tallest building, but one of the top 5 tallest buildings in the entire world. Only 80 meters had been built before construction was then halted in the wake of the revelation from the Shenzhen Housing and Construction Bureau that substandard sea sand concrete had been used in its construction. And so look, the financial incentive to use illegal sea sand, which is significantly cheaper than legal river sand, is likely the reason for the problem here. A number of people may be wondering, well, why? Why can you not use sea sand? I mean, it's the same kind of thing, right? It's sand. Why can't you use that? And well, the issue is that untreated sea sand is it's not something that is suitable for construction. Sea sand contains chlorine as well as salt, and those are two things which go and corrode steel. River sand from freshwater channels, well, that's not something that is going to have that problem, meaning it's a much higher quality material to be used for construction. But for Chinese builders by the coast on a time crunch, well, that doesn't really matter. The problem with using this kind of material is that it can only take a few decades for a building to become dangerously unsafe if untreated sea sand is used in its concrete, including the possibility of total collapse. And the crazy part is, this scandal did not happen 30 or 40 years ago. We don't really have any idea of just how many buildings in China were built using this type of sand without then taking samples from each building and then having them tested in a lab. But if it took decades to find the problem regarding the concrete, you can be sure that its use must have been heavily prevalent in the industry. That means that buildings could collapse or sink at any time. And China is riddled with this type of concrete, which can oftentimes be broken and crumbled by hand. And what's even more amazing is the reactions of the local citizens, because while many people may grumble to themselves, publicly complaining about something that the CCP is doing, that is an easy way to get yourself in trouble in China. Yet the videos showcasing these terrible construction techniques are becoming so common that the government can't really put a stop to them. They are just being put out more and more and more onto the internet. There are even a few moments where people had had enough and took to the world to hear their cries. And the first major incident of this would be after the 2008 Sichuan earthquake. The thing that we're going to be talking about here is something that is truly terrible. On May 12th, 2008, a massive magnitude 8 earthquake would rock the province of Sichuan in central China. The ground would shake with enough force for it to be felt over 1,000 miles away in Shanghai, where skyscrapers would go and sway. Over 69,000 people would end up dying as a result of this quake, with 375,000 people injured and over 18,000 people missing. It left at least 4.5 million people homeless. It was the strongest earthquake to hit China since 1950 and the 18th deadliest earthquake of all time. The government would ultimately have to spend $145 billion over the next 3 years just to try and rebuild. And the worst part about this entire disaster that we are talking about here is the easily preventable loss of life. The entire thing did not need to be as bad as what it was, but because of everything that we've talked about, well, you can imagine the damage. In one single afternoon, decades of shoddy building practices were uncovered for the Chinese population and the entire world to see. Over 7,000 poorly constructed schoolrooms would collapse. And due to the one-child policy that China had at the time, many families would lose their only child in this disaster. 5,335 children would end up losing their lives that day, according to official sources. Some claim that as many as 10,000 children had actually died, and that the CCP is just downplaying the numbers. It is unclear which claim is more accurate, though. The ridiculous part is that many crumbled schoolhouses would be seen with older buildings that were just standing undamaged, with nothing wrong. This wasn't destruction due to age. It was due to carelessness and greed. In the case of Sichuan, education ministry officials and contractors were accused of skimming money from the school construction budgets in order to keep it for themselves. This is something that was made even worse by China's massive wealth inequality, which means that rural communities, like in the case of Sichuan, have smaller budgets for construction from the start anyway. And so with less money to spend, the officials were accused of purchasing low-quality materials and hiring unqualified architects architects and contractors, these being individuals who would charge less or who had more political ties than actual knowledge or experience. Others would say that materials that were meant for school construction projects were instead sold by contractors for a personal profit. After visiting China in 2011, a Canadian journalist by the name of Lawrence Solomon would write that people were afraid of these tofu dreg projects. Specifically, he would say that, quote, they feared that a tofu dam might fail, leading to hundreds of thousands of downstream victims. And what was the government's response to all of this, you may wonder? Well, in June of 2008, the police would end up breaking up protests by grieving parents of dead students that were demanding an investigation as well as the right to sue. Parents were then placed under surveillance in order to try and stop them from pursuing their case. Instead, to try and mollify them somewhat, parents were given a lump sum of less than $5,000 and simultaneously 100 yuan, which is around $10 per month, in supplementary benefits, because that was worth the life of a child. Even with these benefits that would be provided, some people would continue to complain and would ultimately end up being punished. One of these people, as an example, was Liu Xiaokun, a school employee who would take photographs of collapsed schools and then post them on the internet. This person would be sentenced to a year in a labor camp, although he was then later released due to the international attention on this particular case. But he wasn't the only one who would end up being detained for speaking up about the Sichuan earthquake. A former teacher would go and write an essay about his experience with the earthquake, but he was also detained. Huang Xi, an activist who criticized the government's response to the earthquake on a website, was then sentenced to 3 years in prison. That all being said, some Chinese new organizations did take a more aggressive approach to the issue of the school collapses, even though they were then ordered to stop. Foreign journalists would try to interview parents, but these would end up being detained and had their equipment broken by security officers. For every testimony, for every picture, for every video that ended up coming out of the situation, you can be sure that there was at least a dozen more that never made it out due to what the CCP tried to do in order to shut it all down. And so a number of you may be looking at this and going, well, is the CCP really at fault here for what was happening? I mean, yes, they were obviously shutting down all the stuff for the protests, but it's not like the CCP is the one that directly had these buildings built, right? It was the local contractors. So what's wrong there? Well, that's just it. They are involved at pretty much every single level. As an example of what I'm talking about here, another problem that persists within construction in China is that in China, projects are often rushed for impending state anniversaries. As an example, ahead of the 90th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party on July 1st, 2011, a number of construction projects opened, including the Jiaozhou Bay Bridge. This would be the world's longest bridge over water. Well, aggregate. And what does that mean exactly, you may wonder? Well, the world's largest bridge over water that is continuous is actually the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway in Louisiana. In total, the Jiaozhou Bay Bridge crosses over more water, but not in one stretch like the Louisiana Bridge does. However, a CCTV report just days after the bridge opened showed missing and unsecured bolts and gaps in the guardrail. Reports blamed workers' haste to finish the bridge in time for the Communist Party's 90th anniversary. In 2007, a bridge in Hunan province, intended to open in time for the 50th anniversary of the founding of the local prefecture, collapsed during construction, killing 64 people. These projects, known as tribute projects, have gained a great deal of negative attention in China, and it's due to rushing to meet deadlines like this that the number one cause of death for Chinese construction workers is accidents in the workplace. And over time, more and more and more and more of this would occur as things would gradually grow and become worse. The situation with public outcry regarding these dangerous buildings would reach a fever pitch last year. On the afternoon of July 23, 2003, the number 34 middle school of Qiqihar in Longsha district was in the middle of its weekly Sunday girls volleyball team practice. Construction had been occurring on another part of campus just next door, and construction workers had been storing building materials on the roof of the gymnasium. These materials were mostly comprised of large sacks of perlite, which is a building material used in plasters, concrete, mortar, insulation, and ceiling tiles. Now, all this doesn't necessarily sound too bad, but then you need to remember that a interesting characteristic of perlite is that when it is exposed to water, it will soak it up like a sponge. This is something that causes it to drastically expand in size and weight, and if you're wondering how much, we're talking about 4 times the size and weight. You can imagine then what would happen next. Over the course of the weekend, there was heavy rains across the province. Storms rolled through and soaked the region on Friday and Saturday, and by the time that Sunday afternoon had come, those bags of perlite had added thousands of pounds to the gymnasium roof. And at 2:56 p.m., the stresses were simply too much for the structure to support, and the roof collapsed. Inside were 19 people. It was the girls' junior high volleyball team and their 2 coaches. 10 of these players and 1 coach ended up being killed in the collapse. And what was a disaster in and of itself was then only made worse by the government's handling of the incident. Social media users would go and complain that the police in Shichihar had immediately gathered parents together in order to prevent them from staging protests, but had shared little information about their daughters, following a pattern of Chinese government efforts to try and suppress information after disasters. In Sichuan back in 2008, local police had allowed protests in the days after the earthquake, but then later clamped down, as we said earlier. What's worse is that they held these parents without giving them any information about whether their child was alive or dead, and not allowing them to go identify the bodies for hours. They prolonged and amplified the suffering that those parents were going through, and the word of this began to spread rapidly throughout China. Sichuan may have been bad. Sichuan back in 2008 may have been bad, but the collapse of many schools in the district had prompted the Ministry of Education to issue regulations in 2009, requiring national and local government safety checks. These kinds of things weren't supposed to happen anymore, and yet a quick Google search will show you that building collapses happen in China with alarming frequency. And the biggest, the easiest, the greatest case of insanity that you can possibly make on this entire thing can easily be summed up by telling the story of Evergrande. In a previous video that I did talking about how the Chinese economy is a lie, I had mentioned Evergrande, but I didn't go into nearly as much detail regarding them, and here's why. The China Evergrande Group is a Chinese property developer and the second largest in China by sales. Do you remember that guy that I talked about in the beginning of this video who back in 1996 tried to start a real estate development company? Yeah, it actually ended up working out really well for him. This was businessman Hui Kaiyan. He is the individual who had found Evergrande, formerly known as the Hengda Group, in 1996 in Guangzhou in southern China. And this company is easily one of the greatest examples of being in the right place at the right time. As middle-class Chinese people began to flock to purchase homes, Evergrande and dozens of other companies like it were eager to meet this need. But Evergrande is a special story because not only was it a massive success, but its hubris is nearly unprecedented. And here's some of the stuff that this group did. After going public back in 2009, Evergrande would go and purchase the controlling stake in Chinese Super League football club Guangzhou, renaming it Guangzhou Evergrande. They spent billions of dollars getting foreign players, helping the club to win a series of titles. The company would then also move into dairy, into grain, into the oil business. They even at one point tried to build an electric car. This reckless spending just continued to happen over time, and Evergrande didn't really care. They were building so many properties that they would just use the value of their current properties in order to obtain loans to help build future properties. Effectively, what it is that they had done was found an infinite loop in order to make more and more money, something that would be sustainable so long as nothing came along that could possibly completely derail the economy of the world for months or years at a time, like perhaps a worldwide event that could force everyone to shelter at home, perhaps related to a very infectious illness. Obviously, you all know what it is that I'm referring to here, and I'm not trying to get flagged by YouTube for talking about the subject, but 2019 going into the early 2020s was a hell of a time. But either way, I'm getting ahead of myself. That whole thing has not exactly happened yet. Because over the course of the 2000s and into the 2010s, Evergrande just couldn't stop growing. In 2014, they launched Evergrande Spring, a mineral water brand, and invested billions into it. This included doing things like hiring Jackie Chan to do advertising for that product, and literally none of this has anything to do with real estate. Absolutely nothing. But that's my point. Evergrande grew so fast, so big, spent so much money so ludicrously quick and large that they never even managed to make sure that the initial service that they were trying to invest in was both sustainable and actually built to last. Rumors of quality issues with Evergrande properties began to fly in the early 2010s, but that didn't really matter yet. Still, the spending would continue. And for anyone who is watching this right now, if you think that I'm exaggerating, if you think that I'm being just a little bit crazy here, you haven't heard crazy yet, because just listen to the company's spending habits over just a couple years. In the year 2015, they spent billions acquiring Ruyi Pictures, which is a TV and film production company, and obtaining a majority stake ownership of the Hengten Networks Group, a Chinese equivalent to Netflix, essentially. In March of 2015, Evergrande would go and acquire New Media Group Holdings and rename it Evergrande Health. Evergrande Health Group would then operate the Evergrande Health Valley in Nanning, and the Health Valley is a health and wellness park and retirement community. Again, kind of diversifying while their main product quality continued to dwindle. In November of 2015, Evergrande would acquire a 50% stake in the Sino-Singapore Great Eastern Life Insurance Company for $617 million and changed its name to Evergrande Life. It also, at the same time, would go on to own shares in Shenzhen Bank and has also sold wealth management products to consumers. In September of 2016, a year later, after a loss of 4 billion yuan, Evergrande would sell all of its agribusiness units, which included its mineral water brand, its dairy business, and grain and oil business for 2.7 billion yuan. Later that year, Evergrande would then announce it was investing 300 million yuan to build more than 110 pig farms in southwestern Guizhou province. Yes, they got rid of agriculture to invest in more agriculture. By the year 2017, the founder of the company, Mr. Hui, had become the richest man in Asia with a net worth of nearly $43 billion. According to the company's website, Evergrande Real Estate currently owns more than 1,300 projects in more than 280 cities across China. Because it owned so many properties, investors just kept lending and lending and lending. It seemed to be something that was completely stable. At the height of its success, Evergrande had borrowed over $300 billion from lenders. From that, in 2018, Evergrande would become the most valuable real estate company in the world, just months after missing its first bond payment and officially being declared in default by the S&P Global. Yet still, Evergrande could not stop buying stuff. They spent billions on getting into the electric car business, losing massively on this investment. Fast forward into April 2020, fresh into the pandemic, and Evergrande would go and open the construction of Guangzhou Evergrande Football Stadium. Something that, considering a pandemic was going on, meant that there wouldn't actually be anyone there to buy seats for it. You can kind of understand the problem there. This was bad, and some powers were starting to realize it. In 2020, CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping's government would start to tighten the real estate market based on the principle that property is to be lived in, not to be speculated on. New restrictions would then lead to a downturn in the property market, with sales declining by 30% in 2021. And so yeah, this is all happening in 2020 and 2021, at the same time that a nasty little bug from Wuhan is about to make the entire world have a very nasty time. I mean, I myself, I know that anyone who's watching this right now is probably not going to care, but I myself worked in a medical laboratory testing for it for years. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and I did that for 2 years. That was fun. And I say that sarcastically because while it was definitely not fun for me, it was even worse for Evergrande Group. Because the thing is, when quarantines kept everyone from leaving their home, no one was actually trying to buy a new one anymore. And the way the Chinese construction industry works is that if there is no money, there's no buildings. Nothing happens. There's no construction. So if a project is 90% done and the contractors hear, oh, there's no more money, they'll just tell their crews to leave the site until funding is obtained again. They just stop working entirely. And that is exactly what happened with the Ocean Flower Island project. Over the course of 12 years, Evergrande would invest over $13 billion into building an artificial archipelago known as the Ocean Flower Island. Due to illegally obtained building permits, construction was put on hold. The buildings began to suffer from rain damage, and before building could be resumed, Evergrande was then ordered to demolish all 39 buildings on the islands, even though they hadn't been completely finished or even used in the first place. By the year 2020, Evergrande had become the world's most heavily indebted company. And when we were talking about all this, the Ocean Flower Island debacle is just one of many massive projects throughout Chinese real estate, and really just in general that happens within China that were built sort of unfinished and would ultimately fail. Many of these, even the ones that were successfully built, would just sit there and remain empty with no one to actually occupy any of them. This is something that happens with such great frequency that within China, the term that is used to describe these kinds of cities that would essentially pop up overnight and have no one to occupy them would become ghost cities. much in the same ways we associate things of ghost towns, but ghost towns are things that were gradually abandoned. No one ever moved into these in the first place. To understand the scope of what it is that I'm talking about here, one of the great projects that China embarked upon was literally building a recreation of Paris in rural China. They did it, and it sits almost entirely empty. This is a project that cost over $1 billion to make, and nothing was ever done. So, one is then going to wonder then, why did Evergrande do this? Why did they fail so spectacularly? Well, first off, many people would go and buy properties from Evergrande even before building work would begin in the first place. This is something that I talked about in the previous video that I did on why the Chinese economy is a lie, but the system by which Chinese people have to buy houses is incredibly predatory. It is something that is heavily in favor of the companies that build houses because they can effectively take the money and leave if they wanted to. Once a person has paid a deposit, they can potentially lose all of that money if the company goes bust. There is literally nothing to save them to actually have a house built in the first place, even if they prepay it in its entirety. In addition to that, there are also the companies that do business with Evergrande. And it's not just the average person that is buying the home that gets screwed over in the situation. It is pretty much anyone that has to work with the overall company. Construction firms, design firms, material suppliers, anyone that works with one of these companies is at risk if they end up going under. And so it is then that not only is the person screwed, the company is screwed, all the workers under them are screwed, and this can create a cascading bankruptcy effect that creates a much wider economic problem. And that could have a massive impact on China's financial system. If Evergrande, one of the largest companies to ever exist on Earth, collapses, banks and other lenders may be forced to lend less. And what I just listed there, that is talking about the immediate economic effects, but there are potential longer lasting ones that are going to affect people that aren't even affiliated with any of this in the first place. The idea goes something like this. If Evergrande goes and collapses, then the banks and other lenders who would lend money to such a major great company that have lost so much investment going into it, then they may more than likely not be willing to lend money to others who actually need it to start up their own businesses or to fund other projects. This is then something that can lead to a situation called a credit crunch, where companies will struggle to borrow money at affordable rates. And a credit crunch is something that would be very bad news for the world's second largest economy, because companies that can't borrow are going to find it difficult to grow. And in some cases, some of these companies may cease operating altogether. This may in turn unnerve foreign investors who aren't willing to put their money into China, seeing it as a less attractive place to actually house their investments. This is something that would in turn create waves that eventually would influence the rest of the world's economies, and it would be really interesting at that point to see what actually happens with Evergrande. But really, the biggest reason that Evergrande failing is such a big deal is because it is by far the biggest player around. I mean, I want you to imagine, this is the equivalent of what if Walmart or Amazon suddenly got so far into debt that it nearly caused the collapse of its vendors, its distribution system, all of its investors, every single person that in any way, shape, or form could be affiliated with the companies. And really, if the biggest player in an industry, if something is happening to them negatively, you can bet that that is probably going to start affecting the ones after them. This has been proven as Tofu Dregs continue to be built even to this very day. In late 2021, protesters began to group outside of Evergrande's headquarters, demanding that their homes be finished being built or for their money to be returned to them. But at this point, it's unclear if anything was actually done for them. Some of these people's life savings were tied up in these investments, as was the case for many Chinese average citizens. One woman was recorded as having thrown herself to the ground, crying, "If you won't return my money, I may as well throw myself into the river." By this point, Evergrande has filed for bankruptcy in the US in an attempt to try and save its overseas assets, as its stock price has fallen by over 99% since 2018. And again, we need to go and we need to circle back to get context. Why did the Chinese property market go so incredibly out of control? Well, this all goes back to the way that the Chinese economic system is set up in the first place. Private investment is something that is extremely risky and it's hard to come by. The least risky way to invest your money in China for decades has been property, as we said from the very beginning of this video. Whether you plan to live in the real estate or not, well, that's really besides the point. People would just buy a property, hold it for a few years, sell it off, and continuously repeat this cycle, trying to get as much money out of it as they could. Meanwhile, others were just trying to buy a property to live in, to hold on to it so that they would have something of value to be able to pass down to their descendants. Also, traditionally in Chinese culture, if you're going to go and ask someone to marry you, then you are expected to already have a house. So going into this entire situation, there is both societal as well as economic pushes trying to drive people into the real estate market. What this ultimately ends up adding up to is around $60 trillion a year. When you account for all of this together, all of the construction, all the speculation, everything combined, this means that real estate accounts for approximately 30% of the entire GDP of China. And again, I've already covered as to why that number is a lie in the first place. And a lot of the construction that goes into that number would be Tofu Dregs. Recent examples of Tofu Dreg projects include the Pavilia Farm in Hong Kong, which is a residential development described by South China Morning Post as a, quote, unprecedented blunder after concrete tests revealed the usage of the wrong concrete mix. The development was demolished before claiming fatal victims, and the entire construction team was fired. In 2020, the Three Gorges Dam in Hubei province, the world's largest hydroelectric dam, was reportedly in danger of collapsing due to exceptionally high floodwaters. During its construction, there had been allegations of corrupt officials taking bribes from unqualified contractors, and Beijing revealed that nearly 100 cases of corruption, bribery, and embezzlement related to the project were being prosecuted. In May of 2021, Shenzhen's SEG Plaza skyscraper was evacuated after it started shaking inexplicably. Of course, there was the horrific gymnasium collapse that I mentioned before in July of 2023 in Qiqihar, and in November of 2023, another building would collapse in Wenzhou City, killing 4. Every single time that there is a rainy season, it proves the quality of China's buildings, and it's not a matter of whether buildings will collapse or fail, but rather which buildings will collapse or fail and when. Another example is that a couple years back, there was a Comic-Con that was being held during the rainy season, and the entire convention center and the surrounding buildings ended up being flooded with over a foot of backed up sewage and rainwater from shoddy, inadequate plumbing and drainage. The entire situation stinks. And really, in the end, one of the crazy parts about this entire thing is that the Chinese government is really in no rush to try to bail out Evergrande or anything like that. They could see that what Evergrande effectively was running here was a type of Ponzi scheme, something where they would take upon more debt for another project just to kick the can down the road and address at a later time, while continuously trying to build themselves up. Things would actually end up coming to a head in 2020 when the government, fearing that the entire property market was about to burst in one massive bubble, went and introduced new financial regulatory guidelines called the 3 Red Lines. What all of this ultimately ended up doing was that it severely restricted developers' ability to borrow more money, something that would only end up exasperating the crisis that mired Evergrande and the rest of China's property sector. For China's leader, this was something that was incredibly painful. They didn't want to do this, but in order to be able to try and rein in the unsustainable debt that was being accrued by all of these varying different companies, it was really the only solution that they had. Fast forward to only this past year, really a few months ago, and in late September of 2023, Evergrande's chairman, Hui Kai-yan, would end up being arrested. At this time, trading in Evergrande shares would be completely suspended. But when we are talking about this, the collapse of China's largest company in the largest form of investment in its entire economy, this is something that should ring alarm bells across the entire world. Because if Evergrande can fail, then anyone in China can. And because of that, through all of this, the citizens of China do remain worried. Evergrande is effectively circling the drain, and investors looking upon the situation are wondering if China is actually a safe bet to place their money into. What this property crisis, the explosion of the housing market, Tofu Dregs, what all of this combined means for the overall economy, we don't quite know yet. For that, honestly, we'll have to wait and see. But my friends, this has been Sakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you. Remember, if you could go ahead and like this video right now, if you could really do that, subscribe, comment something in the comment section. Because of the video that I'm talking about here, because of the topic, this is generally speaking something that YouTube typically has a bit of an issue with. Thus, any help that you can give would be greatly appreciated, and I thank each and every one of you. Goodbye, my friends, and I will see you next time.